Hello, and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. We are told that wisdom comes from experience, and that experience frequently comes from the lack of wisdom, and that perhaps the best way that we can gain wisdom is from the experience of others. In this week's episode of Horns, we hear from Patrick Cohrs, a history professor at the University of Florence, who has written a book about the new Atlantic Order in the long 20th century, stretching as he defines it from 1860 to the 1930s. Why, you might ask, is a book about this development relevant to events today? Well, as we take a look, Cohrs outlines how the missteps of an order that was envisioned as global in scale, yet ended up involving principally partners in the Atlantic region, led to the events that led to World War II and also influenced the formation of the post-World War II world order that replaced it. Today, as the world grapples with the formation of a post-Cold War, post-Cold War world order in which we are seeing naked aggression from some states, as well as a decline of the liberal rules-based order that we've come to know, we might ask ourselves, what lessons can we glean from the past? This book talk gives us great insight into just what those lessons might be. This event was held at the University of Texas, Austin, and was hosted by Mark Lawrence, director of the LBJ Presidential Library. Let's listen in.
It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. It's been a bit of an odyssey to come here from Florence via New York, but I think especially after 2 years and 2 more years of COVID, to come back to sort of formats where we actually are in the same room and we can debate and discuss works of scholarship. This is the lifeblood of universities and what's been missing for such a long time. So I would like to talk today about the new Atlantic Order and what I mean by the transformation of the world order in the long 20th century. I'll come back to that. But I would like to start with a disclaimer. So one of the, I think, challenges that LBJ had and one of his predecessors, Woodrow Wilson, was to raise immense expectations that they then found hard to fulfill. Wilson obviously encountered this problem during the Great War and then very much at the Paris Peace Conference and of course in the so-called treaty fight after 1919. Why am I saying this? I came through New York and there were 2 things that struck me. First of all, the price of cappuccino in the United States would cause a revolution in Florence. This is about, you can get 10 cappuccinos in Florence for the price of 1. And then the second thing I remarked was that the bar has been raised when it comes to expectations of what historians should do, because a magazine was staring at me where a New York-based historian was presented as being able to explain everything. This is impressive, I find. I cannot do this. So I will not even try to do this, but what I would like to do in earnest is to give you a sense of what this book is about and why I wrote it. And I would like to start by reflecting for a moment on the time we are in. I think it is in some ways a kind of watershed time. It's a time when we have crises, war, all kinds of calamities that seem to shake us out of the kinds of understandings, maybe also corruptions, old ways that we got used to, and force us to face challenges in a new way. And so I think today it is somewhat easier to go back 100 years and to reflect on the massive impact that the Great War had on the world, but especially on relations between the United States and Europe, in a global sphere, on the repositioning of the United States in the world, but also that can lead us to reflect on what can such crises really achieve. So they can expose very mercilessly the things that do not work anymore. 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson, who I just mentioned, stated on many occasions that the old kind of order that had existed before 1914 had led to this great war and it had to be replaced. And what he meant was the order or disorder still quite dominated by European empires, European imperial powers that in an era of rapid change were globalizing their competition, as imperialist powers, as colonial powers, but also in a way that actually led to a constellation that by 1914 did not leave them with any means to prevent the escalation of a major war. So Wilson, in many ways, stated that lessons had to be drawn from such a crisis. And my book, in many ways, is about the question of why, despite the tremendous profundity and earth-shaking scale of the crisis that the Great War presented, in the end, it seems it was not quite possible to draw more fundamental lessons, to build a new kind of international order that prevented the escalation of another big conflict, and that actually created something that I would call a modern international order, a legitimate international order for the long 20th century. And this is the question that stands at the outset of this book. So why has it become such a long book, you might ask? And you're right to ask. So what I would like to do is to explain just briefly what the context is in which I wrote it, and why looking at the Paris Peace Conference, the role of Woodrow Wilson, all the problems and the unfinished nature of the peace that was made after 1918 led me ever more towards trying to think that it is not sufficient to look at moments or certain constellations. What we have to understand is the bigger picture. The systemic changes, the fundamental changes, not just in terms of power relations, imperialisms, and the like, but also more fundamentally of mentalities, political cultures, assumptions about the modern world, and ways in which statesmen, but also wider societies, maneuvered to try to pursue their various national and imperial aims, but also to bring something like stability, something like an international system into being that would prevent modern industrialized barbaric warfare. So this is where, in my view, it is quite remarkable. We just had the 100th anniversary of the Paris Peace Conference, and you had many conferences, many books that came out at this occasion. But I would argue, somewhat provocatively, that while there's one trend that's very beneficial and very important, namely that our understanding of this war and the Paris Peace Conference has globalized. We see it in a more global way. We are trying to not just see it as a transatlantic or European phenomenon. We also try to assess more than before what impact it had on the wider world, on East Asia, on the global South, and so on. But quite remarkably, in my view, there were not many new books that emerged at this point that really engaged with the fundamental questions of this piece in a new way, or that opened our eyes in ways that casts a different light on this piece. Because I would say we had, on the one hand, old battles fought anew in terms of who was to blame for the problems of this peace. Should it have been enforced more resolutely against Weimar Germany? Or should it have been more inclusive? What happened to the League of Nations? So these are old battles fought anew. Or we have a lot of contributions from transnational and global history that are very important, but they do not deal to quite an extent with these more fundamental, in my view, more central questions of peacemaking anymore, because they are more interested in placing other actors on the map and widening our understanding in that way. So this is a phenomenon I would call compartmentalism in international history. And this leads to interesting studies, but it leads to overall a trend that loses sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is then consigned to textbooks, which reiterate old interpretations. So what I'm trying to do with this book is to go beyond this. Some of the most interesting books that actually came out around 2019 were, for example, those by Jörn Leonhard. He wrote a global history of the First World War, and then a global history of peacemaking. Leonard concluded that in the end, war was the winner of the Great War. Yeah? So this is one way of putting it. And he then spoke of an overburdened peace. Yeah? So many complexities, basically it was impossible to found a stable peace. This is a very influential way of looking at this. Certain New York-based former colleagues of mine, like Adam Tooze, would have suggested that we need to look especially at the financial and economic, sort of fundamental tectonic changes that this war brought about, not least in catapulting the United States into the position of becoming something like a world creditor and the foremost economic power. Yet, in my book, I try to engage with this, but also to contest the view that in the end, it's underlying economic and financial forces that reshape the power landscape of Europe, of the United States, and the wider world. I am interested in politics, international politics, and that's why the book is called The Transformation of International Politics. And so what I'm trying to show in this book is that we need to look at a wider context, a context that takes us back to the origins of the developments that led to the Great War. And in my view, this takes us back to the beginning of the long 20th century. What do I mean by that? So first of all, I think nowadays historiography is quite dominated still by two very important schools. Schools on the long 19th century. We can think of Eric Hobsbawm's path-breaking work, but it's very synthetic work, but very, very influential. And of course, the path-breaking work by scholars like Jürgen Osterhammel, who did write a massive history, the transformation of the world in the long 19th century. Yet if you look at the long 19th century, then at its end, the world is still dominated by different forms of imperial states. So it's a world that soon crumbles, that changes in shape and content under the impact of the First World War. So we might need a different explanation of why that occurred. Yet there is another school, I would argue. We can still start with Hobsbawm, the age of extreme, the short 20th century. This is again very much a kind of view of world history influenced by the Cold War. So here, the Great War and the Paris Peace Conference would be the starting point of the systemic competition between the Bolshevik, Leninist alternative trajectory into the future and the liberal capitalist American-dominated one. This is also very influential, but I think it misses, in my view, it misses a lot of the actual dynamics that we need to understand. And further, I would think of works by Westad and others that basically have expanded the history of the Cold War backwards. So again, it's the Cold War that we need to see the wider origins of, and that then is taken into the 21st century. So what I'm arguing is that in terms of the transformation of the basic understandings, underlying principles, rules, and modes of politics, it is more interesting to think of a long 20th century. And this century dawns at a time in the 1860s when the previously dominating order, the Vienna system, a very Eurocentric system, crumbles under forces that have to do with the Industrial Revolution, the changes of nationalism and national self-determination aspiration in Europe, but also the globalizing imperialist competition. At the same time, the 1860s take us into an era where the kinds of modern states emerge or re-emerge that eventually will fight the great wars of the 20th century. Obviously, we can think of the origins of the unification of the German Empire, the Italian unification, the reorganization of France in the Third Republic after the defeat of 1870, 1871, and then there is Britain and the Tsarist Empire. But we also should put into this picture two other main powers, Japan, which undergoes not a Meiji restoration, but a Meiji revolution, in response to the Western onslaught on China, and puts Japan into a position of being in the club when it comes to the question of who is among the leading world powers of the future. And then there is the United States. And I would, in my book, I talk of a re-emergence, a reunification of the United States. Of course, a very long process. But in the 1860s, obviously, in the Civil War, one thing is decided on Lincoln's and Grant's terms, namely that there should be one United States and not two competing states that would have changed the course of world history. So here we have the basics for the emergence of the United States as a world power, but also as a world power that in many ways is a very unorthodox world power, because it keeps out of most of those kinds of affairs that we associate with world power status before 1914. So the underlying point I try to make in the first part of this book, so a mere 250 pages or so, has to do with what I call the involution of international politics. Basically the idea that while we have very dynamic developments at the state level within societies, the international system cannot keep track. So once we had a European concert, once we had ideas of extending international law, now we are in the age of realpolitik, sort of glorified by actors like Bismarck and others, where you have a lot of means and ends, sort of you do whatever is necessary to attain your goals and to become, in the end, a respected world power. So there are many attempts made by reformers, by the Socialist International, by international lawyers, by those who were trying to push European and American governments towards the Hague Conventions to try to tame this, to find a modern framework for this immensely dynamic and potentially catastrophic competition that ensued. Not just between different world powers that on civilizational Darwinist terms were really going for the question of who would be among the top ones and who would fall behind. But also between European powers who at the same time engaged in this industrialized armament. So by the time of 1914, this kind of mismatch between the dynamics at the state and societal level and the lack of development at the international level lead to a constellation where, famously, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, was calling for a European concert, was calling for some mechanism to resolve the problems between the great powers in Europe after the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. But there was no longer any such mechanism. There was no longer any way to settle this peacefully, and you all know what happened then. So this is the beginning, what I call the dawn of the long 20th century. And in my view, the First World War, the Paris Peace Conference, but also attempts to reform the very inadequate, in some ways very inadequate first attempt at peace of 1919 in the 1920s, they are all attempts to deal with not just the German problem or the Bolshevik Revolution, but the underlying question of what should finally replace and supersede the no longer working Eurocentric system of the 19th century. What should become a global order of the long 20th century? And here, obviously, if we look at this, we need to see two things. On the one hand, this is a process in which all of a sudden the United States is catapulted into a position that it had never been in, namely to assume almost a kind of leading position in this struggle, whereas there was hardly a degree of preparedness for such a role in the inner societal debates in the United States, in Congress, and even on the part of an internationally highly inexperienced president called Woodrow Wilson, who now had to undergo a tremendous learning process to try to fulfill the role that he had cast himself into in his own speeches. So what I'm trying to show is that if we want to understand what was possible and what was not possible at the Paris Peace Conference, we need to get away from history as blame game. History as looking at, so who is responsible for making the wrong decisions, for setting Europe or the United States on the wrong kind of path, but rather to pursue an approach that I call comprehensive or integrated international history. And what I mean by that is we need to understand a process that ensued already during the First World War and then came to a crescendo at the Paris Peace Conference, a struggle between different alternatives of what should be the ground rules of the modern international order. And this was a struggle not just in which not just leaders of government were engaged, but also countless actors, political parties, non-governmental pressure groups, transnationally operating activists and others, that made the Paris peace process of 1919 the most complex, the broadest, but also the most inchoate peace process, I think, in history. And this process we need to understand. Nonetheless, and this is one of the core arguments of my book, was not truly a global process. There was a lot of rhetoric about a new world order, universal terms, universal self-determination, and so on. But the reality of this process was distinctly hierarchical. There was at the core the question of, could peace be made on modern new terms as an almost democratic peace, as Wilson seemed to suggest, open diplomacy, transparency, a peace of the peoples. Or would it be a peace in which a lot of new rhetoric would be used to cloak underlying great power interests, not least imperial interests, not just of, obviously, the victorious imperial powers, Britain and France, but also many others who were not prepared to cede ground to this new kind of modern peacemaking, but who rather were trying to order the world in a way that also suited their imperial interests. So in many ways, what I'm trying to show is that while the rhetoric pertained to a new world order, what lay at the heart of this peacemaking process of 1919 was the struggle to find the contours, the institutions, the understandings in security, in economic terms, even in civilizational terms, of a new Atlantic order, namely a process of exchange, of negotiation between the Woodrow Wilson and many American actors on the one hand, the main victors that I mentioned, Britain and France on the other, but also many others who wanted to have a place in the negotiations, especially, and this is one of the key aspects of this book, those in the defunct German Empire who now were on a path towards wanting to be part of this progressive new order, who founded the Weimar Republic, established the most progressive constitution that was far more democratic than the American Constitution of 1919 or the British or the French. But that said that in return for their advances, they wanted to be part of all the new institutions, the League of Nations, the kind of peace settlement that Wilson seemed to have promised. So at the heart of this world and global struggle, I'm trying to suggest is something we need to understand, is this struggle for a new Atlantic order. Why did it fail so miserably? So this takes a few further 100 pages to discuss. But what I'm trying to show at the core of this book is that we need to understand how dramatically international politics changed and was recast, not least through the Great War. So in essence, what the peacemakers of 1919 had to try to do was not just to find a common ground between their various strategies, national aims, and great promises, such as the League of Nations. They also, of course, were the representatives of very imperfect, but nonetheless fundamentally democratic systems that needed to win legitimacy for whatever they were doing at home. So this sets up a model of international politics that was highly influential, I would say, throughout the long 20th century, that reverberated throughout this century. It is a model in which you come to compromises. You have to forge complex agreements that try to balance different security considerations, peace considerations, economic considerations, and others. And we see this in 1919 really under a magnifying glass when we think of the treatment of Germany after 1918. So for the French protagonists, Clemenceau, André Tardieu, and others, these were not reactionary nationalists who wanted to go back to the 19th century. They had very plausible and very important security concerns of what would happen in Germany. Would there be a revolution that leads to a stable democracy? Would German politics be moderated, or should one contain Germany in the future? And for them, it was, of course, so essential that they would have Anglo-American and especially American security guarantees to get reassurance that they would not have to face this demographically and economically superior neighbor on their own in the future. That is why, if you think about it, it's French protagonists who developed first conceptions of something like a North Atlantic alliance. So if you think, if you're trying to find the origins of NATO, they are in the conceptual planning of Tardieu and other French strategists in 1917 and 1918. This then clashed with rationales that Wilson was proposing of getting over old-style alliance and security politics, of using the League of Nations and collective security and essentially integrative ideas of peace and security to bring stability and pacification to Europe. Originally, very importantly, of developing a vision in which everyone who was prepared to play according to these rules, including Germany, would be part of this new League of Nations order. And what Wilson had to do and had to struggle to do when he actually arrived in Paris was to realize that he had neither the charisma nor the cultural capital or the kind of soft power, we would say nowadays, to impose this kind of vision. Instead, he had to learn something that no American president before him had ever had to do, namely to forge a very difficult international compromise and then to go back home and sell this to the American people. And the same applied to Lloyd George and many others. So I'm trying to suggest that if we go beyond blame game history and we look at the wider context, we see a struggle of different actors trying to make peace in a new way. So another reason why the book is somewhat longer is obviously the one that it tries to show very clearly that after a catastrophe like the Great War, it was very unrealistic to suggest that you can make peace and establish a stable order at one peace conference. That you make a kind of peace that then is so stable that basically things are fine. On the contrary, what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to also understand the next phase of the long 20th century in a new way. So very important interpretative models for this period are the interwar period, the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, and many different interpretations that all have in common that they somehow suggest that there was something almost inevitable, from the crisis of 1919 towards the crisis of the 1930s, towards the escalation of the Second World War. What I'm trying to suggest in this book, and this then goes towards the epilogue already, so you can breathe a sigh of relief, is that we need to understand the Paris Peace Conference as a very formative beginning of a much longer reordering and pacification process in which first Wilson and the protagonists of 1919, but then their successors in the 1920s were trying to work out these new common ground rules, and not least to find a way to make this not an illegitimate or partial, or only a piece of the victors, or only a piece that left out major players like Weimar Germany or the Soviet Union. It is quite realistic to assume that this would take a longer time. And more fundamentally, and this comes back to my original point at the outset, we cannot expect learning processes and lessons to lead in a linear fashion to great revelations shortly after a big war and then to wonderful peace settlements. It's a much longer, more difficult, more dialectical process. And in the post-war era of the First World War, these kinds of processes find their fruition, or a certain kind of fruition, in the new settlements that emerge in the mid-1920s. So this is also something I already wrote my first book about, so I'm just sort of referring to this briefly in this book, but I think it's important to look at this. So it's the Peace Pact of Locarno, the first pact actually negotiated with the representatives of Weimar Germany and including the Weimar Republic into an emerging Euro-Atlantic concert. Later, the degree in which the Republican administrations of the 1920s were not involved in the actual politics, but were playing the role of a patron in the background, of trying to promote European stabilization. This is a period, in other words, that is not the pre-period, the pre-history of the Second World War. It's the post-World War I history. It's something we can build on nowadays if we try to understand later developments that Jeremy could talk much more about, like the Helsinki process. So to understand, so the wider intervention here is to get away from the history of international politics in the 20th century as great peace settlements, failures, and then wars, but towards what I call a 60-year peacemaking process. So this starts around 1914 and finds its sort of climax in the Euro-Atlantic sphere in the early 1960s, where you have the basic outline of something like an Atlantic community, a Pax Atlantica. So my next book will take this history further from 1933 and the crisis of the 1930s towards this later attempt to learn lessons from 1919, the 1920s, and of course the Great Depression in building a more durable order after the Second World War. Now, a final point, so the book is also an attempt to put European, US, and Atlantic history in conversation with global history. And here again, I cannot explain everything. I wish I had all the languages that I would have to write a book of the kind Jürgen Osterhammel wrote on the 19th century. But what I'm trying to do is to situate all these developments in a global context. I'm trying to show what was the impact of these Euro-Atlantic negotiations on the wider world? How were they perceived in East Asia? How did Chinese and other actors look at this? And to what extent, and this is the sort of guiding question, do we have to ask ourselves, were two very independent or sort of different processes occurring in the long 20th century? On the one hand, the emergence of a kind of Euro-Atlantic peace system with certain rules, understandings, and also a very particular US role behavior. I would call it a hegemon, a primus inter pares that allowed quite a large degree of cooperation, of consultation, with many problems and drawbacks. But nonetheless, compared with other big powers of the 20th century. And then a global dimension where quite different rules applied, where for different reasons the call for self-determination and democratic development and economic development was hierarchically modulated. There was a lot of rhetoric, but the actual practices of US administrations, of Europeans, were much more neo-imperial than hegemonic. And so the book also tries to suggest that we should not sort of play off European and Atlantic history against global history, but rather to see both as part of a bigger picture. And finally, the book is an attempt to go beyond the compartmentalism of, let's say, those who say that they're practicing diplomatic history and interstate history, and others who practice transnational history or whatever else they are doing, but to suggest that for the actors that we are interested in, we simply have to realize they all lived in one world and they all had to interact. And some had far more power, had far more legitimacy. But if you think about the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, it is particularly the new kind of actors who are trying to change the playing field of international politics. It's not just Wilson who is advocating more transparency, the idea that you need to go and gain support from the people, from the voters for the kinds of peace you want to make. It is many associations and organizations in the United States, in Europe and elsewhere who think that the time has come to make a more democratic and modern peace. And yet, of course, because it failed and because it exposed so many of the double standards and the hierarchical assumptions, not least of Wilson, who classically was a president who thought that in the end, I would argue, he was not a liberal internationalist, he was an Americanist. He had the idea that certain peoples, because of their religious, cultural, civilizational predisposition, were more capable than others of exercising self-government. And others had to be taught or kept in a kind of tutorial position for a long time. And he was not alone in that, but I've studied Wilson a lot. I just don't think that he had a catharsis and all of a sudden became a very egalitarian internationalist. Because if we look at figures like Jane Addams and the protagonist of the Women's Peace Party and many others, if you read what they wrote, they try to have a more egalitarian, real internationalist outlook, not Wilson. So it's another of these battles. Finally, the book also tries to suggest that this formative period of the long 20th century is one that speaks to our time, because it's the period of immense systemic competition. So when Wilson and others were trying to go for the more democratic world order conception with all the problems, you still had thinkers, military strategists, and policymakers in Germany thinking about a German hyper-empire in Eastern Europe, and of a new world order in which they had to basically colonize Ukraine and other parts of the world to be able to stand their ground in the future competition they imagined with the British Empire and the American Empire as they saw it. And of course we have the classic, and this I do not deny that, I write a lot about Lenin and Trotsky and the others who were offering a counter vision. So they also, to me, can only be understood in their impact in what they wanted to do, because they were trying to show some of the basic problems, inequities that emerged at the dawn of the long 20th century, and they were offering a different road forward. The only thing that I do argue in the book is that we should not artificially elevate them to a status of being the main counterforce to Wilson. So this is, of course, if you think of Arno Meyer and very important work, it is a work of its time. We should have a more global, a broader outlook than that. And nonetheless, this is one of the other dimensions of this big struggle. For Lenin, famously, and for Stalin later, the US attempt to found something like an Atlantic order was what he thought was most dangerous to the future of his power, to the future of the communist experiment, but also to the future of Russia. And so Stalin famously called the Locarno Pact a joke. And the whole idea of collective security, international agreements, he called a joke as well in 1925. So allow me just a final sort of reflection. So this book is less a book that will then give you lessons for what to do in this concrete crisis of how to arm Ukraine and how to deal with Putin. But I think in the bigger picture, it tries to show that the main problems often lie in the prehistory of how do we get into a situation like the one we are in now. And this has a lot to do with things that Paul Schroeder wrote about the 19th century, or Thucydides about the Peloponnesian War, namely complacency, false perceptions, or simply the idea that you can have your cake and eat it again and have it again. That you can have all the good things in the world, especially this is something that many American administrations thought in the 1920s, that they could stay out of international agreements, but still use the economic influence to influence everyone else, that they could stay out of any real security agreements, but that others would over time adopt the American model. Well, so one of the lessons would be, let's look back at what happened in 1989, 1991. Were real attempts made to restructure the international order after the so-called victory? My former colleague John Gaddis would give you one sort of interpretation of what could be done and what should be done. I would argue that we should look more closely at the pre-Putin era, of the way in which the United States and the West European states treated Russia at a time of humiliation and of regrouping in the 1990s, when there were obvious wishes that rightly were taken seriously from Poland, then Czechoslovakia and other Central East European states to become part of this Euro-Atlantic order. So let me stop then with this book being also an appeal to understand not just moments and crises, but also longer term, bigger picture developments that I find are too often either misunderstood or not even considered in scholarship and, of course, in political discussions. And finally, I should mention as a selling point, I've tried to summarize these main points in a rather lengthy introduction to this book. So even if you just like the cover image and will never get through this book, you can still buy it and read the introduction, and I hope you'll get something out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.